No one expected the Israel trip to blow up like this. What was supposed to be a peaceful, spiritual journey for Joni and Doug turned into a chaotic mess caught on camera. Tension rose, whispers spread, and moments that were never meant to be seen went viral within hours. But it was Jonathan's reaction, silent, sharp, and impossible to ignore, that told the real story. Something is very, very wrong. It started quietly. No headlines, no drama, just a photo and a message sent from thousands of miles away. Susie Lamb was sitting in her kitchen in Montana, sipping coffee, trying to enjoy a slow morning. Life had been quieter lately, more stillness, less noise. But that morning, everything shifted. She looked down at her phone and saw a message from her friend, Rose Howard, who was visiting Israel. Attached was a photo of a folded prayer note pressed into the cracks of the Western Wall. Alongside the image, a simple message: "You're being lifted up in Israel today." That was it. No long paragraph, no explanation, just that. At first, Susie smiled. It felt kind, thoughtful. But the more she looked at it, the more her heart stirred. That note had their names, hers and Jonathan's, written on it. It was placed in one of the holiest places on earth, a wall where millions have come to cry out to God. And in that moment, Susie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seen. Not by people, not by cameras or church crowds, but by God. And then it hit her. At that exact time, Joni and Doug were also in Israel, smiling for the cameras, meeting with leaders, standing on the same streets, representing the ministry that had once belonged to her husband's family. The timing wasn't just a coincidence. It felt divine. Almost like God was reminding her, "I still see you. I haven't forgotten your story." That photo brought back a memory from years earlier, 2017, when she and Jonathan had visited the Western Wall together. She had been pregnant with their first son. Jonathan had written out a heartfelt prayer asking God to guide his life and help him stay in his will. They named their son Israel, not knowing how meaningful that name would one day become. Now, years later, their names were once again tucked into the wall, but this time it wasn't about asking. It was about being reminded that even when it feels like everything has been taken away, God is still writing. And that quiet message was the spark that lit something deep inside them both. At first, there were no signs of a storm. Jonathan and Susie Lamb were doing what they had always done, showing up, leading worship, smiling for the cameras, pouring their hearts into a ministry they believed in. Daystar wasn't just their workplace. It was their legacy. It was family. For years, they had stood in the spotlight, sharing messages of hope, speaking life into people's homes, and honoring the network Marcus and Joni Lamb had built from the ground up. But after Marcus passed away, something in the air shifted, slowly, quietly, almost like a shadow stretching across a familiar place. At first, it was subtle. Meetings that used to be warm and collaborative began to feel tense. People started using phrases like optics and brand more than calling and ministry. Jonathan started to notice the shift, but he brushed it off. Grief changes people, he thought. Maybe this was just a rough season, but the heaviness didn't lift. Conversations with leadership started feeling more like monologues. Decisions were made behind closed doors. Questions were no longer welcomed. What once felt like a spiritual family was beginning to look more like a corporation, and the pressure to fall in line grew stronger with each passing month. Jonathan wanted to believe the best. He'd grown up in this ministry. His earliest memories were inside those walls, watching his dad preach with passion, watching his mom manage it all with determination. He believed in the mission. He still did, but he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. Susie saw it too. She watched her husband carry the weight of it all, staying up late, trying to make sense of the changes, praying for wisdom, holding on to faith even as it began to crack. He didn't complain much. That wasn't his style, but she knew. She could see it in his eyes. Then came the day that changed everything. They were asked to participate in a segment celebrating Joni's new marriage to Doug Weiss. It was already controversial. Many in the Christian world were still processing it. But now, Jonathan was being asked to publicly support it on air. The production team handed him a short statement, something kind, positive, polished. Just a few lines. Say this. Smile. Move on. But as Jonathan looked at the paper, something inside him stopped. The words weren't his, and more importantly, he didn't believe them. He felt no peace. And for Jonathan, that mattered more than anything. He had been taught since he was young that you don't speak what isn't true, not before people, and especially not before God. So he put the paper down, and he said no. The room went still. It wasn't loud, no shouting, no arguments, just a quiet refusal. But in that moment, everything shifted. It didn't matter how softly he said it. To some, it looked like defiance. To others, disloyalty. And to those in power, it was the final straw. From that moment on, the clock started ticking. The next few days felt like a blur. Jonathan and Susie were pulled into meetings that didn't feel like conversations. They felt like decisions had already been made. Their schedules were cleared. Invitations disappeared. Events they were supposed to lead were suddenly reassigned. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. They were being pushed out. Within a week, they were gone. No farewell. No thank you segment. No, we bless them as they go. Just silence. The kind of silence that hurts more than words ever could. For a while, they didn't know how to talk about it. What do you even say when the place you gave your life to acts like you never existed? They didn't go on interviews. They didn't post statements. They didn't defend themselves. They just disappeared from the screen. And, it seemed, from people's memories. And it wasn't just a job they lost. It was their community, their church, their daily rhythm, the people they celebrated birthdays with, the staff they prayed with, the place they once called home. Some friends stopped calling. Some avoided them at church. Others whispered behind their backs, guessing what really happened. Rumors started almost immediately, some wild, some subtle, but all painful. Jonathan felt like he was carrying a stone in his chest. He had seen ministries fall apart before, but never thought it would happen like this. Not to his own family, not to the ministry his father built with tears and prayer. He wasn't angry, at least not at first. He was just deeply, deeply heartbroken. Susie tried to hold him up during those months. She prayed over him when he couldn't pray for himself. She reminded him that God's calling didn't depend on approval from others. But still, there were nights when the pain was too much. Nights when they sat in the dark, asking each other, how did it come to this? Eventually, they made the hardest decision they'd ever made. They left Texas. Not to run, not to make a statement, but to breathe. They packed up their life, their memories, and their heartbreak, and moved to Montana. There were no lights there, no microphones, no scheduled segments or backstage chaos, just open skies, quiet mornings, and a chance to heal. At first, it felt strange. Ministry life had shaped everything about them, their schedules, their identity, even their faith. Now, all of that was gone. The silence felt heavy. The grief sat in the background like an unwanted guest. But slowly, something began to shift. The quiet turned into peace. The stillness became sacred. Without anyone watching, they learned to breathe again, to pray again, to trust again. It wasn't the plan. They didn't ask for this path. But somewhere along the way, they realized the separation from Daystar wasn't just a loss. It was a mercy, because sometimes God has to pull you out of the spotlight so he can show you who you really are and who you were always meant to be. Montana wasn't the dream. It wasn't the plan. It wasn't the place they thought they'd end up after years of ministry, television, and church leadership. But when Jonathan and Susie Lamb packed up their life in Texas and left behind everything familiar, they weren't chasing a fresh start. They were escaping the noise. After the silent split from Daystar, everything felt like a blur. One day they were on camera, leading worship, praying with viewers, and preparing for the next taping. The next, their names were gone from the schedule. The doors were shut, the phone stopped ringing, and nobody said a word. No goodbyes, no blessing, just silence. At first, they didn't know how to process it. It was more than losing a job. It was losing a world they had poured their hearts into. Friends vanished. People avoided them at church. Rumors swirled. They felt erased. And the worst part? They still loved so many of the people in that world. It wasn't just hurt. It was heartbreak. So they left. Not to prove anything. Not out of spite. But because staying in the middle of that silence would have crushed them. Montana felt like the opposite of everything they'd known. No stages, no lights, no pressure to perform. Just wide skies, quiet roads, and the kind of stillness that makes you face yourself. At first, it was uncomfortable. The mornings were too quiet. The air felt too still. They were used to movement. Meetings, rehearsals, events, deadlines. Out here, there was none of that. Just them, their kids, their faith, and their wounds. Susie held the family together with quiet strength. She found peace in simple things: walking by the lake, reading scripture out loud, cooking meals in a house that finally felt like a home, not a studio. She didn't need microphones or an audience to minister. She just loved her family and trusted God in the dark. Jonathan struggled more. He had spent his entire life in front of cameras. He was a lamb. His name meant something in Christian circles, but now all the titles were gone. There was no schedule, no leadership role, no one asking for his opinion. He had nothing to manage, nothing to fix, just the ache in his chest and the question he couldn't shake. Who am I without the ministry? Some mornings he couldn't pray. He'd sit with his journal open, staring at the page, not because he didn't believe in God, but because the pain had made everything feel distant. He wasn't angry at God, he just felt lost, betrayed maybe, by people, by the system, by the machine he once believed in. But little by little, the silence started to change. It wasn't just absence anymore. It became space, a space to breathe, to think, to feel, a space for God to speak again. And it was in that stillness, those long, quiet mornings in Montana, that something sacred began to take root. Jonathan started writing again, not sermons or sound bites, just raw thoughts, things he was feeling, doubts he was wrestling with, moments of grace that found him when he wasn't looking. His words weren't polished, but they were real, and that honesty started to heal something inside him. They found a small church down the road, nothing fancy, no production team, no broadcast schedule, just a group of people who loved God and welcomed them like they were no different than anyone else. No one cared about the last name. No one asked about Daystar. They were just Jonathan and Susie, two people trying to find their way again. That church became a safe place, a quiet one, and for the first time in years, they weren't performing faith. They were living it. Their kids adjusted too. They ran through fields, played by the lake, and watched their parents become human again. Less stressed, less busy, more present. Home became more than a location. It became a feeling, a rhythm, a place of peace. As the weeks turned into months, Jonathan and Susie began sharing small reflections online. Not dramatic stories, not rants, just gentle thoughts about faith, pain, and healing. They didn't do it for attention. They weren't trying to stay relevant. They just couldn't keep quiet about what God was doing in their lives, even in the shadows. And surprisingly, people responded. Messages started coming in from strangers, people who had been hurt by church, people who walked away from religion but hadn't stopped hoping that maybe God was still good, people who saw themselves in Jonathan and Susie's quiet honesty. Some had left ministries of their own, some had lost faith in leadership, some were holding on by a thread, and somehow the Lamb story gave them hope again, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. Their pain had become a bridge, not a wall. They didn't try to be spiritual influencers. They didn't try to rebuild a brand. They just showed up with open hands and open hearts, and people noticed. One night, sitting on their back porch as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Susie looked at Jonathan and said, This is ministry, not the lights, not the stage, just this. Loving God, loving each other, and helping people feel seen again. And she was right. What they had in Montana wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was sacred. And sometimes it takes losing everything to finally find what matters most. Jonathan still carried the scars. So did Susie. But now, those scars weren't signs of failure. They were reminders of survival, proof that you can walk through fire and still come out whole, even if you come out different. They had traded the noise for stillness, and in that stillness, they found something stronger than applause. They found peace. Jonathan never wanted a comeback. He wasn't sitting in Montana dreaming of stages or networks or big crowds waiting to hear him speak again. After everything that happened, the last thing he wanted was to return to the world that had broken him. The silence had been painful, yes, but it had also healed him. He had learned to breathe again. He had found peace, and with that peace came something better than relevance, clarity. But God wasn't finished. It started slowly, like most things do when they're real. A text from someone they hadn't heard from in years. A message from a stranger who had read one of Jonathan's quiet online reflections and just wanted to say, "Thank you. I really needed this." A handwritten letter from someone who'd seen their family disappear from TV and had quietly wondered, did they give up? Are they okay? And then came the ones that hit the hardest. Messages from people who had walked away from church. Not because they stopped believing in God, but because they couldn't handle the pressure, the performance, the silence around the things that were never supposed to be ignored. They saw Jonathan and Susie's story, and for the first time in years, they felt like someone understood. Jonathan didn't know how to respond to most of them. He'd sit at his desk, rereading a paragraph from someone pouring out their heart, and feel the same ache he'd carried in his own chest for months. But that ache began to shift. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was purpose. He wasn't being called back to a platform. He was being called to people, real people, quiet people, people who didn't want a show, just someone to walk with them, people who were trying to believe again. Believe in grace, in faith, in a God who sees through the noise. Susie saw it happening too. She never pushed him. She never said, "It's time to go back." She just stayed close, listened, prayed, held space for whatever God was doing. She had grown in the silence too. She had found her voice. Not the loud, stage-ready kind, but the steady, quiet strength that carries others when they can't stand on their own. Together, they began to dream again, not about rebuilding a ministry, but about starting something new. Not a comeback, not a return, a different path entirely, a movement. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't built in meetings or on spreadsheets. It was born in the same way their healing began, with honesty. They didn't want to recreate the structure they had left. They wanted to build something simpler, something real, a space where people didn't have to pretend to be okay to belong. They called it a movement because that's what it felt like. Not a building, not a brand, but a stirring. A pull back to what matters. A return to truth, to faith without performance, to Jesus without layers of expectation and image. It started in their living room. Just a few people. A couple chairs, coffee brewing in the kitchen, kids playing down the hall. A circle of friends and neighbors who wanted to talk about God but didn't want to be talked at. They came with questions, with doubt, with old church wounds and open hearts. And Jonathan didn't preach. He shared. Susie didn't teach. She listened. They cried. They laughed. They prayed in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. They sat in silence when no one had the words. It wasn't flashy, but it was sacred. People started showing up who had sworn they'd never go to church again. People who had been hurt, dismissed, silenced. People who thought maybe faith wasn't for them anymore. And somehow, in that quiet space, they felt safe again. Word spread, not because of ads or marketing, but because people talk when they've tasted something real. And what was happening in that living room was real. Soon, Jonathan started getting invitations to speak again. Small churches, conferences, not big platforms, just rooms full of people looking for something honest. He turned down most of them at first. He was still careful, still healing. But the more he spoke, the more he realized God wasn't sending him back to the old system. He was sending him to the brokenhearted. He talked about grace, about walking through fire, about what it's like to lose everything you thought mattered and still find that God was there, not just waiting on the other side, but walking with you through it. Susie's voice grew too. She started sharing short devotionals, scriptures that had carried her through her darkest nights, thoughts about motherhood, identity, peace, and letting go of the need to be perfect. Her posts were quiet but powerful. People began calling her the gentle fire. Her words didn't shout, but they lit something inside people. Together, Jonathan and Susie became something they never expected. Safe people. People who weren't trying to impress, just trying to serve. Back in Texas, some whispers started to spread. People at Daystar had begun noticing their influence growing again, not because they were trying to take anything back, but because people were drawn to truth. There were rumors, talk that maybe Jonathan would return, that maybe he was meant to carry the mantle after all. But Jonathan wasn't interested in mantles. He wasn't trying to retake a throne. He wasn't looking to rebuild what had been lost. He knew what that cost. And he wasn't willing to lose his peace again for the sake of public approval. He had no need to prove himself anymore. He just wanted to be faithful. One night, as the fire crackled in their backyard and the kids ran around catching lightning bugs, Jonathan turned to Susie and said, "What if this is it? Not something bigger, just this. People, healing, honesty." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's more than enough." And it was. But still, something was stirring. Not pressure, not demand. Just this gentle sense that God was up to something more. That the pain hadn't been wasted. That the silence had been part of the preparation. So they kept showing up, kept praying, kept creating space for others to be seen. Their gatherings grew, slowly, naturally. More stories poured in, more people found hope in their journey, not because they had the answers, but because they weren't afraid of the questions. And that's what made it a movement, not perfection, not performance. Just people who refused to let the fire of their faith die, even after the storm. Jonathan and Susie weren't making a comeback. They were building something new, and they were finally free.